You ever look at a legend and wonder how they managed to live with themselves? Forget the spotlight. Think about a cheap hotel room at 3 a.m. In one room, you've got Carl Perkins. He's awake, hands shaking, staring at a bottle. He's drinking to forget a wrecked car, a stolen career, and a dead brother. Right next door in the other room is Johnny Cash. He's awake too, has been for 3 days, heart pounding from amphetamines, paranoid, seeing ghosts in the shadows. This is not a story about success. This is a story about two broken men trying to keep each other alive. They were best friends, not because they both made rock and roll. They were best friends because one knew exactly what the other's addiction looked like. They were brothers in faith, prisoners of fame. The architect's path began on April 9, 1932 in Tiptonville, Tennessee. It's known as Lake County, a sliver of land pressed up against the Mississippi River. To be born here, in this year, to a family of sharecroppers was to be born into a system of economic slavery. Carl Lee Perkins was the son of Buck and Louise Perkins. Buck was a tenant farmer, which meant he owned nothing. Not the land he worked, not the shack he lived in, not the tools he used. He and his family, Carl and his older brothers, Jay and Clayton, were essentially property of the landowner, paid in scrip or a tiny fraction of the crop they harvested. It was a system that made it nearly impossible to escape poverty. The Perkins family lived in a 3-room, unpainted plank shack. There was no electricity, no running water. The wind blew through the cracks in the walls. Carl would later say, "We were so poor, a rich man's dog would have turned his nose up at the way we lived." From the age of 6, Carl was in the fields. His job was to drag a heavy burlap sack, his small hands learning to pick and pull the sharp, stubborn cotton bolls from sunrise to sunset. This was not a childhood. It was indentured servitude. But this world of grinding poverty was defined by two crucial forces. The first was the failing health of his father. Buck Perkins was a good man, but a broken one. His health was shattered, leaving him often too sick to work. This dynamic, often overlooked, is the key to Carl's entire personality. In a world where a man's only value was his physical labor, Carl's father was seen as a failure. This instilled in young Carl a terrifying sense of responsibility. He, his brothers, and his mother had to work twice as hard to make up the difference, to keep the family from starving or being thrown off the land. This is the source of Carl's legendary drive, but it's also the source of his insecurity. He grew up ashamed of his poverty, ashamed of his family's predicament. This shame would fuel his ambition, but it would also lead him to create a new, more powerful version of himself. As noted by the Country Music Hall of Fame in later years, Carl would embroider truths. He'd fabricate stories of miraculously surviving childhood diseases or claim athletic prowess he never had. He wasn't a pathological liar. He was a storyteller, and his first and most important creation was himself. He was rejecting the victim image, the poor white trash label that the world had tried to stamp on him. He was building a persona, a defense against the humiliation of his origins. The second force, the one that would save him, was music. It was everywhere. It was the one thing that was free. From the white side of the community, he absorbed the sound of the Grand Ole Opry on a battery-powered radio, the heartfelt, high, lonesome sound of Roy Acuff. From his mother, Louise, he learned the gospel hymns that gave a shape and a name to their suffering and their hope. But the true magic, the secret ingredient, came from the other side of the field. In that segregated world, poor whites and poor blacks worked the same land, often side by side. The misery was shared. And from the black sharecroppers, Carl heard a sound he had never heard on the Opry. It was the blues, It was raw, rhythmic, and deeply, profoundly human. His father, Buck, despite his illness, gave Carl his first instrument. It was a guitar, but barely. He fashioned it from a discarded cigar box, a broomstick for the neck, and some leftover baling wire for strings. It was a crude makeshift object, but to 6-year-old Carl, it was invaluable. He learned to make noise on it, to find a melody, but he didn't know how to make it sing. The key was given to him by a man named John Westbrook. Uncle John, as Carl called him, was an elderly black sharecropper, a field hand in his 60s. Carl would sit at his feet mesmerized as Westbrook played his worn-out acoustic guitar, his fingers dancing on the strings, his voice deep and soulful. Carl, a small white boy, asked this man how he made the notes seem to bend and twist, how he made them cry with such emotion. Westbrook, with the patience of a grandfather, smiled and showed him. He showed him how to vibrate the strings, how to fret a note and then pull it, bending it sharp, making the strings strain against the neck. He taught him about blue notes, the notes that live between the cracks of the piano keys, the notes of the human voice. He told him to get down close to the wood to find the real sound. This was a profoundly important moment. This was the foundational DNA of rock and roll. In that dusty cotton field, a 6-year-old white boy, armed with a cigar box guitar, was receiving a one-on-one master class in the Delta blues from a black master. Carl would spend the rest of his life chasing that sound. He would later say, "I was a white boy, but I had a black man's rhythm." He was taking the white hillbilly country he heard on the radio and injecting it with the raw, rhythmic, syncopated feel of John Westbrook. He was creating a hybrid, a new musical DNA. By 1946, Carl Perkins was 14, and he was already a seasoned musician. He had convinced his father to buy him a real, if beat-up electric guitar and a small amplifier. This was a radical act. He was plugging in the blues. He and his brothers, Jay on rhythm guitar and Clayton on upright bass, formed a band. They were initially called the Tennessee Ramblers. They were raw, they were loud, and they were unlike anything else in Jackson, Tennessee. Carl, still a teenager, was playing in the rough, violent, smoke-filled taverns, the honky-tonks that dotted the highways. This was his true education. He wasn't just playing for applause, he was playing for survival. He was playing for drunk, rowdy, and often dangerous crowds. He had to play music with a beat, music you could fight to, dance to, and drink to. He was learning how to command a room, how to play with a relentless, driving rhythm that was part country, part blues, all energy. He was no longer just Carl Perkins, the sharecropper's son. He was the hillbilly cat, a walking, talking, guitar-playing revolution, waiting for a spark to ignite him. He was ready for the 1950s. Just 7 weeks before Carl Perkins was born, and a few hundred miles southwest, another son of the Depression entered the world. On February 26, 1932, in Kingsland, Arkansas, J.R. Cash was born. His parents, Ray and Carrie, couldn't agree on a name, so J.R. is what they put on the birth certificate. Like the Perkins family, the Cash family was drowning in poverty. Ray Cash was a farmer, a sawyer, a railroad man, anything he could be to keep his family of 7 children from starving. But in 1935, a lifeline appeared. The Cash family was selected for one of the most radical and forgotten experiments in American history, the Dias Colony. This was part of President Roosevelt's New Deal. The government had cleared 16,000 acres of swampland in northeast Arkansas and divided it into small 20 and 40-acre plots. They built brand new 5-room, whitewashed houses. They gave each selected family a plot of land, a mule, a cow, and 20 years to pay it back at a low interest rate. This was not a handout. It was a chance. It was a government-sponsored opportunity to build a life out of the mud. For 3-year-old J.R. Cash, Dias was the only home he would really ever know. It was a brand new house, a symbol of hope. But this hope was built on back-breaking labor. The land was fertile, but it had to be cleared. J.R. was in the cotton fields from the age of 5, working alongside his parents and siblings. His father, Ray, was a hard, pragmatic, and often emotionally distant man. The work was relentless. In 1937, a massive flood inundated the area, forcing the family to evacuate. J.R. would never forget the sight of his world underwater, an event he would later immortalize in the song 5 Feet High and Rising. Like Carl Perkins, J.R.'s only escapes were God and music. But his musical education was different. His mother, Carrie, was the heart of the family. She played an old acoustic guitar and sang hymns and sentimental Irish folk ballads, her voice filling the small house. J.R. absorbed everything. He learned to sing from her, his high, clear, and deeply earnest voice, a stark contrast to the rough world around him. He listened to the radio, to the gospel quartets, and most importantly, to the Carter family, whose mournful, stoic songs of family, faith, and hardship spoke directly to his soul. But the defining, shattering event of J.R. Cash's life, the singular moment that would forge the Man in Black, happened on a Tuesday in May 1944. J.R. was 12 years old. His older brother Jack was his absolute hero. Jack, 2 years older, was everything J.R. was not. J.R. was restless and moody, while Jack was spiritual, steady, and seen as the good son. He was a devout boy who spoke of becoming a preacher. That week, J.R. had a terrible premonition. Nay, he felt a sense of dread, a feeling that something awful was about to happen to his brother. He begged Jack not to go to work, to come fishing with him instead, but Jack, ever the responsible son, had to work. He had a job at the local high school's agricultural co-op, cutting oak logs into fence posts on a large, unguarded table saw. J.R. went fishing, but the dark premonition wouldn't leave him. He returned home early, filled with a sick dread. A short time later, he saw his father's truck speeding down the dirt road. J.R. ran out to meet it. His father, Ray, his face a mask of terror, told him, "Jack's been hurt. He's been hurt bad." The accident was horrific. Jack had been pulled into the spinning blade. The saw had cut him from his stomach up through his ribs, nearly severing him in two. By the time J.R. and his father got to the hospital, Jack was lying on a table, conscious, his insides exposed. The doctor, knowing it was hopeless, had simply sewn him up. Jack did not die. Not then. He lingered for over a week. J.R., that 12-year-old boy, sat by his bedside, watching his hero, his best friend, his spiritual guide, be eaten alive by gangrene. He watched him suffer in agonizing, unimaginable pain. He listened as Jack, in his delirium, spoke of angels, of heaven, of a beautiful river. On May 20th, 1944, Jack finally died. His last words, spoken to his family, were, "What a wonderful, beautiful, glorious day. I'm seeing a beautiful, beautiful river. I'm going." The moment Jack died, J.R. Cash's childhood ended. It was not just grief. It was a profound, soul-crushing guilt. He believed with the terrible, irrational certainty of a 12-year-old that he was responsible. If only he had forced Jack to go fishing. He was the bad brother, and the good brother had been taken in his place. This guilt became the central psychological wound of his life. It was the source of his darkness, his melancholy, and his complex lifelong anger. It was the source of his profound empathy for the prisoner, the sinner, the outcast. When Johnny Cash later sang about a man who shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, he sang it with an authenticity that chilled the bone because he too felt like a killer. This trauma, the death of Jack, is the key to everything. It is the origin story of the man in black. By the late 1940s, J.R., like Carl Perkins, was a musician. He was writing songs, his voice, now deepening, already possessed that famous haunted gravitas. He sang on a local Arkansas radio station, but he was still just a farmer's son, trapped in a life he didn't want, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. He graduated high school, worked for a time in an auto plant, but he knew he had to get out. The cotton fields of Dias were no longer a place of hope. They were a constant, painful reminder of the brother he had lost. As the 1940s came to a close, two young men, born just weeks and miles apart, were at a crossroads. Carl Perkins, the sharecropper's son, was the hottest act in the honky-tonks of Jackson, Tennessee, a local king waiting for a bigger crown. J.R. Cash, the haunted farmer's son, was about to sign a form that would change his name and his life, an escape that would send him 4,000 miles away to a divided Germany. They were two parallel lines, forged in the exact same fire of Depression-era poverty, both steeped in the gospel and scarred by profound family trauma. As the new decade of the 1950s dawned, it presented them with a fork in the road, an escape route from the cotton fields that had defined and imprisoned them. Both of their paths, however, were unknowingly leading them to the exact same destination, a small, unassuming studio at 706 Union Avenue in Memphis. They were about to meet Sam Phillips, and the world was about to change forever. One man, the haunted farmer's son, would choose to cross an ocean, hiding himself in the anonymity of the military. The other, the driven sharecropper's son, would choose to stay grinding himself down in the factories and honky-tonks, betting that his sheer will could change his stars. Both paths were an escape and both were a new kind of prison, but in the end, both roads led inevitably to Memphis. On July 7, 1950, J.R. Cash walked into an Air Force recruiting office. He was 18 years old, and he was running. He was running from the suffocating humidity of the cotton fields. He was running from the hard, silent disappointment of his father. But most of all, he was running from the ghost of his brother Jack. The farm in Dias was a graveyard of memories, and he had to get out. The recruiter looked at the enlistment form. J.R. Cash? Son, those aren't a name. That's initials. The military, in its infinite bureaucracy, required a first name. J.R. didn't have one. So on that day, he invented a new man. He became John R. Cash. It was a baptism. J.R. was the boy haunted by guilt. John R. was a new identity, a man with a government serial number and a posting on the other side of the world. He was shipped to Landsberg, West Germany. This was the height of the Cold War. But Cash was not trained for combat. He was not a fighter. He was a listener. His melancholy, his intense, quiet focus, his ability to sit alone with his own thoughts for hours, these all made him the perfect candidate for a highly sensitive, deeply isolating job. John R. Cash became a radio intercept operator for the 12th Radio Squadron Mobile. Imagine the scene. A young man from the cotton fields of Arkansas, now sitting in a dimly lit room in a German barracks, headphones clamped to his ears. His sole job was to tune his high-frequency receiver to the static-filled darkness, listening, for the sound of Soviet Morse code. He was a spy. This job is perhaps the most profound metaphor for his entire life. He was a man who sat alone in the dark, intercepting secret messages from a world he wasn't a part of. He was, by trade, a professional outsider. This lonely, monotonous, high-stress work perfectly suited his melancholic temperament, but it also amplified it. And it was in this cold German isolation that the first cracks began to show. According to his biographers, It was here that Cash first began to dabble in amphetamines. The pills were a tool, a way to stay awake and sharp during the long, mind-numbing shifts of listening to dots and dashes. But for a man already wrestling with a deep existential darkness, the pills were also a comfort. They were a chemical escape from the silence, a way to manage the ghosts that had followed him across the Atlantic. He wasn't just a spy, he was a good one. He became so adept at decoding the signals that on March 5th, 1953, he was the very first American, and possibly the first person in the Western world, to intercept and report the news that Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted dictator of the Soviet Union, was dead. It was a crucial piece of intelligence, and it was decoded by a 21-year-old musician from Arkansas. But he was still a man, not just a machine. He bought his first guitar at a shop in Öhringen. He taught himself to play, and in the barracks, he formed his first real band, the Landsberg Barbarians. They were a raw amateur country outfit, but for Cash, it was a lifeline. It was the only way to break the crushing loneliness of his secret work. And there was another secret, a more personal one, that kept him going. Before he had shipped out on July 18, 1951, he had gone to a roller skating rink in San Antonio, Texas. There, he met a 17-year-old girl from a strict Catholic family. Her name was Vivian Liberto. He was instantly, almost manically smitten. He pursued her with the same obsessive focus he would later apply to his music. They dated for just 3 weeks before the Air Force sent him to Germany. For the next 3 years, their entire relationship was built on paper. They exchanged thousands of letters. We have these letters today, and they are a revelation. They are not the stoic, simple prose of the Man in Black. They are passionate, desperate, obsessive, and deeply romantic. He wrote to her about his fears, his loneliness, his dreams of making music, and his overwhelming, almost painful love for her. He was pouring every ounce of his pent-up emotion into these letters. He was, in effect, writing his first songs. He was living a double life, a cold, emotionless spy by day, and a passionate, desperate romantic by night. And during this time, he endured another, more physical trial. A cyst developed on his jaw. The surgery to remove it, performed in a military hospital, was botched, leaving him with a deep, permanent scar on his face. This scar would later become a part of his rugged, intimidating image. But its origin was not a bar fight. It was a sterile clinical error, a permanent reminder of his cold, isolated time in Germany. On July 3, 1954, Staff Sergeant John R. Cash was honorably discharged. He was 22 years old. He was a veteran, a former intercept operator, still grieving his brother, a scarred man, and already developing a reliance on pills. He collected $3,000 in back pay, flew back to Texas, and on August 7, 1954, just 1 month after his return, he married Vivian Liberto. His old life was over. His new life was about to begin. His target, Memphis. While John R. Cash was decoding Soviet secrets 4,000 miles away, Carl Perkins was trapped in a different kind of grind, one just as monotonous and soul-crushing. He was still in West Tennessee fighting the same war against poverty he had always known. On January 24, 1953, Carl married his sweetheart, Valda Kreider. This is a name that history often forgets, but shouldn't. Valda was Carl's anchor. She was the one stable, unwavering force in his life. Cash had the idea of Vivian, a romantic pen pal an ocean away. Carl had Valda, a present physical partner who believed in his talent with a fiery devotion. She understood his demons, his drive, and his shame, and she gave him the one thing he needed to keep going: permission. She encouraged him to pursue music full-time, even when it seemed like a fool's errand. Full-time was a brutal joke. To support his new wife and growing family, Carl worked a relentless series of grueling day jobs. He worked at the Daybright mattress factory. He worked at the Colonial Baking Company, loading pans and trays in the suffocating heat. These were dead-end manual labor jobs, the very future his father had endured, the future he had sworn to escape. But he was not his father. He was a man possessed. His real life began at 5 p.m. After a 10-hour shift at the bakery, covered in flour and sweat, he wouldn't go home. He, his brothers Jay and Clayton, and their new brilliant drummer, W.S. Fluke Holland, would pile into their beat-up car. They'd drive 100, sometimes 150 miles to play a gig at some rough-and-tumble honky-tonk in rural Arkansas or Mississippi. They would play from 9 p.m. until 3 a.m. to a crowd of drunk, rowdy, and often violent patrons. Carl, drenched in sweat, his fingers bleeding, would then get back in the car, drive the 150 miles back to Jackson, and clock in at the bakery at 6 a.m. He lived this life for years, often on less than 2 hours of sleep a night. This was not a hobby. It was a relentless struggle against his own poverty. He was also, like in his childhood, building his own myth. To the factory workers, he was just Carl. But to the honky-tonk crowds, he was a star. To hide his poverty and lack of a real education, his biographies claim he embroidered truths, claiming he played varsity sports in high school. He hadn't. He had been too busy working. He was still that kid from the cotton fields, building a suit of armor to protect himself from the world's judgment. By 1954, Carl Perkins was 22 years old, but he was exhausted, broke, and profoundly frustrated. He and his band were the tightest, hottest, most explosive act in West Tennessee, but they were playing for pennies to drunks. He was a local king, and it was killing him. And then one day he was listening to the radio. He heard a song he knew, Blue Moon of Kentucky, but it was wrong. It was fast. It was frantic. There was a high, wild, hiccuping voice, full of echo and energy. The DJ announced the singer was Elvis Presley, and the label was Sun Records in Memphis. Carl stood frozen. He later said it was the prettiest sound he'd ever heard. But it was more than just pretty. It was a revelation. It was his sound. The sound he had learned from John Westbrook in the cotton fields. The sound he had been honing in the honky-tonks. The blend of white country and black R&B. Someone else was doing it, and someone was recording it. He ran to Valda. He told his brothers, this was it. This was the door. In October 1954, Carl, Jay, Clayton, and Fluke piled into their car. They were still dirty from their day jobs. They didn't have an appointment. They just drove the 80 miles to Memphis to 706 Union Avenue. They walked into the tiny, cluttered front office of Sun Records and met the man who would change their lives, Sam Phillips. Sam was an eccentric, visionary, and perpetually stressed-out producer. He was already drowning in the chaos created by his new discovery, Elvis. He listened to Perkins, who nervously played a song he'd written called Turn Around. Sam was lukewarm. He heard the potential. He heard the authenticity, but it was raw, and he already had Elvis. He told Carl, that's good, that's real, but you need to work on it. Come back when you have something. It was a polite rejection. For Carl, it was devastating. He had bet everything on this one drive. He drove the 80 miles back to Jackson, defeated. He went back to the bakery, back to the honky-tonks. But the sound of Elvis's record wouldn't leave his head. He kept writing, kept grinding. At the very same time, in the fall of 1954, another man was walking the streets of Memphis, just as desperate as Carl Perkins. John R. Cash had moved to Memphis with his new and now pregnant wife, Vivian. He was a veteran, a husband, and a father-to-be. He was also a failure. He had taken a job as an appliance salesman, going door to door. He was, by all accounts, the worst salesman in the history of Memphis. He was too shy, too melancholic, too haunted. He couldn't sell a toaster to a man in a blizzard. He would come home at night, his order book empty, his pockets empty, facing the terrifying reality that he couldn't provide for his family. He was becoming his father. At night, he pursued his real dream. He had teamed up with two mechanics who worked at his brother's auto shop, Luther Perkins on lead guitar and Marshall Grant on upright bass. They called themselves the Tennessee Two. Luther Perkins was a quiet, unassuming man, but he was a stylistic genius. He didn't know how to play solos. Instead, he had developed a simple, muted boom-chicka-boom rhythm on his guitar that sounded exactly like a train. It was the perfect minimalist heartbeat for Cash's dark narrative songs. Cash, like Perkins, knew his only hope was Sam Phillips. He too showed up at 706 Union Avenue unannounced. He too auditioned. But Cash made a critical error. He played what he thought Sam wanted to hear. He played the gospel songs his mother loved, the songs he'd sung in church. He was presenting himself as J.R. Cash, the good, devout son. Sam Phillips, the man who had recorded the rawest blues artists in the world, was not impressed. He stopped the audition. And in what is now the most famous rejection in music history, Sam looked at Cash and said, "Go home and sin, then come back with a song I can sell." Cash was stunned, but he understood. Sam Phillips acted as much as a psychologist, as a record producer. He didn't see the polite, God-fearing boy in front of him. He saw the man in black. He saw the haunted eyes. He saw the kid who had watched his brother die. He saw the spy who had taken pills in Germany. He saw the sinner, and that was the man he wanted to record. Go home and sin didn't mean go rob a bank. It meant go home, look in the mirror, and write the truth. Write about the darkness. Write about the ghosts. Cash went home. He was a changed man. He stopped writing polite gospel songs and started writing from his own dark personal experience. He wrote a song about a train, Hey Porter, and he wrote a song about a heartbroken man. Cry, 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 he returned to son. He played the songs. Sam Phillips smiled. That was the man. That was the sin. In March 1955, while Cash was waiting for his record to be released, Sam Phillips finally gave Carl Perkins his shot. He released Carl's song, Movie Mag, on his new subsidiary label, Flip. It was a good, solid rockabilly tune. It was a regional hit, strong enough for Sam to move Carl to the main Sun label. Then, in June 1955, Sun Records released Hey Porter with Cry, Cry, Cry as the A-side. It was an instant runaway smash. It climbed high into the top 10 of the Billboard country charts. John R. Cash, the failed appliance salesman, was now officially Johnny Cash, a bona fide country music star. By the end of 1955, the universe had converged on 706 Union Avenue. Sam Phillips now had his core group of stars: Elvis Presley, the King, Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, and Carl Perkins, the Architect. They began touring together, a package show of this new wild sound. The outline for this story notes they met on one of these tours, playing theaters in Arkansas and Mississippi. It was a time of pure, unadulterated brotherhood. Cash, already the established star, saw the raw, untamed talent in Perkins. He pulled him aside and told him, "Carl, you're my kind of singer. You've got what it takes. Go back and see Sam. Don't quit." It was the validation Perkins needed. Soon after, Elvis himself, the King, showed up at one of Carl's rowdy honky-tonk gigs at the El Rancho Club in Jackson. He stood in the back watching, mesmerized, as Carl played his bent-note guitar style. Elvis danced to Carl's music. The stage was now set for the most explosive year in music history. It was the end of 1955. Johnny Cash was a star. Elvis Presley was about to become the biggest star on earth. And Carl Perkins, armed with the validation of his new brothers and a fresh fire in his belly, was about to go home and write a song on a potato sack. A song about a pair of shoes. The fuse was lit. The year was 1956, a moment so important it is impossible to overstate. It was the hinge upon which all of modern music would turn, a year destined to bring both a million-selling triumph and a tragedy that would change the course of music forever. And as that year began, the world was not waiting for Elvis Presley. The world was not waiting for Jerry Lee Lewis. The world, for one brief, shining electric moment, belonged to Carl Perkins. The end of 1955 had been a blur. Johnny Cash was a star. His song Cry, Cry, Cry dominating the country charts. Elvis Presley had seen Carl play at the El Rancho, validating his raw bluesy style. Carl was filled with a new ferocious confidence. He'd proven he belonged. Now he just needed the song. The song came to him as all great truths do, not in a flash of divine inspiration, but as a mumbled command in a dark, sweaty honky-tonk. Perkins was playing a dance in Jackson. He was on a break, watching the floor, when he noticed a young man and his date. The man was dancing awkwardly, trying to keep the girl from scuffing his new, fashionable blue suede shoes. He pulled her back, and Perkins overheard him say, in a stern, serious voice, "Don't step on my blue suedes." Perkins was amused. Blue suedes. He thought it was a funny, vain thing for a poor country boy to care about. But the phrase stuck in his head. It was a title. Later that night, around 3 a.m., he woke up in the small, cramped project house he shared with Valda and his children. The phrase was still there, bouncing around his brain. Blue suede shoes. He stumbled out of bed, grabbed a 3-pound potato sack that had been left in the kitchen, and a pencil. In that moment, the entire song unspooled, fully formed. 1 for the money, 2 for the show. He knew instinctively it was a hit. But he didn't just write a song. He had written a cultural anthem. It wasn't just about shoes. It was about a new post-war generation that had, for the first time in history, a little bit of spending money and a fierce, defiant sense of personal style. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that you can do anything to a man. Slander him, drink his liquor, burn his house. But you do not, under any circumstances, disrespect his identity. He took it to Sam Phillips at Sun Studios on December 19th, 1955. They recorded it fast and raw. Carl, his brothers Jay and Clayton, and Fluke Holland. It was the sound Carl had been chasing his entire life, the driving, syncopated rhythm of a country dance band mixed with the bent note blues licks he had learned from John Westbrook in the cotton fields. When Sam Phillips heard the playback, he famously and correctly predicted, "Carl, that's it. That's your first million seller." Blue Suede Shoes was released on January 1st, 1956. It was not just a song. It was a cultural phenomenon. It exploded across every radio format in America. It did something no song in history had ever done before. It climbed to number 1 on the Billboard country chart, number 2 on the pop chart, and charted on the R&B charts, all at the same time. It was the first million-selling record in the history of Sun Records. For a few fleeting, glorious months, Carl Perkins was the biggest star in the world. He, the poor sharecropper's son, had done it. He was booked for the Perry Como Show, a massive coast-to-coast national television broadcast. This was the big time. This was the appearance that would make him a household name, the one that would officially crown him the King of Rockabilly. Elvis Presley was still a regional sensation, just sold by Sam to RCA. But Carl Perkins was the man with the national multi-format million-selling smash hit. He was the vanguard. In the pre-dawn hours of March 22nd, 1956, Carl, his brothers, and their drummer Fluke Holland were racing towards that destiny. They were driving their brand new Chrysler, a gift from their new success, from Norfolk, Virginia to New York City for the Perry Como appearance. They were exhausted, wired, and triumphant, driving through the night to make it in time. They were near Dover, Delaware. Their driver, a friend named Stuart Pinkham, had been at the wheel for hours. He fell asleep. The car, traveling at high speed, slammed into the back of a pickup truck. It flipped, cartwheeled end over end, and finally came to rest, a mangled wreck in a watery ditch. The scene was a nightmare. Stuart Pinkham, the driver, was killed instantly. Fluke Holland was thrown from the car, suffering lacerations and a broken leg. Clayton Perkins had cuts and bruises. Jay Perkins, Carl's older brother, the rhythm guitarist, had a fractured neck and severe internal injuries. And Carl was found lying face down in the ditch, his head submerged in 2 inches of water. He was unconscious. He had a fractured skull, a severe concussion, and 3 fractured vertebrae in his neck. Perkins's career, just as it was about to reach a national audience, was violently derailed. Carl Perkins woke up in a hospital. He was in traction, his body shattered, his dream in ruins. The papers in New York were already running headlines about the tragic crash, effectively ending his triumphant march to stardom before it even began. He was alive. But the man who had laid down in that car was not the man who woke up in that hospital bed. The man who woke up was a man who had seen destiny, held it in his hand, and had it ripped away in one single violent second of bad luck. And it was in that hospital room that he would suffer the second, and perhaps greater, psychological trauma. He was lying there, paralyzed, his neck in a brace, when a nurse wheeled in a small black and white television. She turned it on. It was Saturday night. It was April 3rd, 1956. He was watching the Milton Berle Show. And on that screen, Carl Perkins watched his old friend, Elvis Presley. Elvis was healthy, he was handsome, he was charismatic, gyrating for a national audience of screaming fans. And the song he was singing as his second ever national television performance was Blue Suede Shoes. Elvis, now on RCA, had been rushed to record the song to capitalize on the buzz. He had even, as a friend, told his audience, "This is a song by a good friend of mine, Carl Perkins, who's in the hospital. We're all pulling for him to get well." It was meant as a tribute. But for Carl, lying there in a haze of pain and medication, it was a symbolic execution. It was his song. It was his television appearance. It was his crown. In that one moment, the paths of the 2 hillbilly cats diverged forever. Fate had stolen Carl's body, and now in his mind Elvis was stealing his kingdom. This is the source of the subtle jealousy that would haunt him. It was not the petty jealousy of a rival. It was the profound, bottomless, cosmic grief of a man who was robbed. He would later say, "I was a dead man. I was watching my life, my future, go out of my hands and into his." While Carl was still in the hospital, fighting for his life, his other friend, Johnny Cash, was in the studio. In May 1956, while Carl was still in a neck brace, Sun Records released I Walk the Line. It was a masterpiece. That signature chickaboom rhythm, Luther Perkins's muted, haunting guitar, and Cash's voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried an unmistakable weight and authority. The song was a monster. It was Cash's first #1 hit on the country charts, and it stayed there for 6 weeks. It crossed over, climbing to number 17 on the pop charts. Johnny Cash, the man Sam Phillips had told to go home and sin, was now the new dark prince of American music. By the time Carl Perkins was finally released from the hospital, months later, the entire world had changed. He was alive, but his career was on life support. The momentum, that unbuyable, unstoppable force, was gone. Elvis was the undisputed king of rock and roll. Johnny Cash was the biggest star in country music. And Carl Perkins, the man who had started it all, was a one-hit wonder. He was a what if. He never, ever fully recovered. Not physically, and certainly not emotionally. He returned to Sun Studios a changed man. He was in constant pain from his neck. He was drinking heavily to numb the physical and emotional trauma. And, as his biographers note, he was suffering from hallucinations linked to the crash, a post-traumatic stress that would feed his demons for decades. He tried to reignite the flame. He went back to the studio and recorded some of the best, most essential music of his life. Boppin' the Blues, Dixie Fried, Matchbox. These songs are now considered sacred texts of rockabilly, but at the time, they were commercial disappointments. They fizzled. The world had moved on. On December 4th, 1956, one of the most famous and most misunderstood moments in music history occurred. Carl was in the Sun studio trying to cut a new song, Matchbox. He was frustrated. His career stalled. Sam Phillips had brought in a new piano player to back him, a wild, arrogant 21-year-old from Louisiana named Jerry Lee Lewis. Johnny Cash, now the label's biggest star, stopped by to listen and say hello. And then the door opened, and the ghost of Carl's stolen destiny walked in. Elvis Presley, now the biggest star on earth, was in town and had stopped by to visit his old boss. It was the only time all four of them would ever be in the same room again. Sam Phillips, knowing history was being made, called the local newspaper and hit the record button. The press would dub them the $1 Million Quartet. But if you listen to the tapes, it's not a supergroup recording. They're not trying to cut hits. It's a wake. It's a jam session, yes, but it's a spontaneous, nostalgic look back at the world they were all about to leave. They're not singing rock and roll. They're singing the songs of their childhood. They're singing Peace in the Valley, Down by the Riverside, Blessed Jesus. It's Carl, Cash, Elvis, and Jerry Lee, all gathered around the piano singing the gospel hymns their mothers had taught them. It's a beautiful, unguarded, and profoundly sad moment. It was a farewell. It was the last time the four hillbilly cats would ever be together as equals. After that day, Elvis went back to Hollywood. Jerry Lee would become a star and then a pariah. And the paths of Cash and Perkins would diverge so violently it would test their brotherhood to its limits. Both men were becoming deeply frustrated with Sam Phillips. The 3% royalty rate was insulting, and Sam, now obsessed with his new $1 Million Quartet member, Jerry Lee Lewis, was ignoring his original stars. Cash was furious that Sun was still releasing his old gospel tracks. Perkins was furious that he was being sidelined. In 1958, Johnny Cash, the biggest and most bankable star in country music, made his move. He left Sun Records and signed a massive, lucrative, career-making contract with the giant Columbia Records in New York. Carl Perkins, desperate to escape his post-accident slump, his career on life support followed his friend. He too signed with Columbia Records in 1958. Hoping to find similar success, this move would seal their fates. At Columbia, Johnny Cash became a global icon. He was given creative freedom and he used it. His first single for the label, 1959's Don't Take Your Guns to Town, was a cinematic narrative masterpiece. It was a massive crossover hit. He was a superstar. At Columbia, Carl Perkins was a commercial disaster. The New York executives didn't understand him. They didn't know what to do with this rockabilly sound, which they now considered dated and hick. They tried to make him sing teen pop. His singles, like Jive After 5, were flops. He was out of his element, a raw performer in a corporate environment that didn't understand him. And as their professional lives diverged, their personal demons were taking root. For Cash, the pressure of being Columbia's new star, the constant touring, the impossible expectations, it was too much. The amphetamines he had dabbled with in Germany were no longer a tool. They were a necessity. He was becoming erratic, thin, his eyes hollow. He was planting the seeds of his own destruction. For Carl, the demon was not yet addiction. It was grief. On October 23, 1958, Jay Perkins, Carl's older brother and rhythm guitarist, died. The cause of death was a brain tumor, but the family and Carl always knew the real cause. The tumor had developed as a direct result of the fractured neck and internal injuries he had sustained in the 1956 car crash. This was the final devastating blow. This was the tragedy from which Carl would never, ever recover. The crash hadn't just stolen his career and his crown. It had now, 2 years later, stolen his brother. He was consumed by guilt. He was the leader of the band. It was his career, his car, his dream that had put them on that highway. In his mind, he was responsible for his brother's death. The 1950s, which had begun with such infinite electric promise, ended in total darkness. Carl Perkins was a 28-year-old man, his career in ruins, his band broken, his brother dead, and his heart shattered. He was adrift, consumed by his losses. Johnny Cash was the biggest star in country music, his future limitless. But he was a man haunted, too, by the ghost of his brother Jack and by the new chemical demon he was inviting into his soul. As the 1960s began, the two men were on completely opposite trajectories, like rockets passing in the night. One, seemingly aimed at the sun, was on top of the world, but secretly falling. The other, aimed at the ground, was at the bottom of a hole, desperately needing a hand to pull him out. Johnny Cash, now at Columbia Records, was ascending into the pop culture stratosphere. He was no longer just a country singer. He was a cultural force. He was a hit-making machine. In 1963, he released Ring of Fire, a song co-written by Merle Kilgore and his touring partner June Carter. With its brooding, descending melody and its iconic mariachi horns, it was a sound no one had ever heard. It was a massive #1 country hit and a top 20 pop crossover. He was, by all measures, on top of the world. Carl Perkins, on the other hand, was in freefall. His move to Columbia, which he had hoped would mirror Cash's, was a commercial wasteland. The New York executives didn't understand him. They didn't get the raw, greasy, bluesy sound he had perfected. They saw him as a one-hit wonder, a relic of a dated sound called rockabilly. They tried to clean him up to make him sing Pink Pedal Pushers, a safe, silly, watered-down teen pop song. It was an insult, and it was a flop. Columbia dropped him. He moved to Decca, where he also flopped. He was seen as an artist whose time had passed, a relic from the 50s. The musical world he had helped to create, the world of rock and roll, had been hijacked by clean-cut teen idols like Frankie Avalon and Fabian. He was back to playing small clubs, a forgotten legend, and he was doing it without his brother. The 1958 death of Jay Perkins, from the injuries sustained in the 1956 crash, had broken something inside Carl. The crash hadn't just stolen his career, it had stolen his family. He was now consumed by a survivor's guilt that was impossible to articulate and, for a man like Carl, impossible to process. He was adrift. But then, in 1964, a strange, unexpected lifeline came from across the ocean. Perkins was invited to tour Great Britain. He was hesitant. He was a failure in his own country. Why would anyone in England care about him? He was booked as an opening act for the great Chuck Berry. He expected to play to empty, indifferent rooms. He was wrong. When he landed at the London airport, he was shocked. He was greeted by a horde of screaming fans and flashing cameras. They weren't there for Chuck Berry. They were there for him. And in that crowd were the four most famous young men on the planet, the Beatles. They weren't just fans, they were disciples. They didn't just want to shake his hand, they wanted to study him. They threw a massive party for him. A young, awestruck George Harrison cornered him, excitedly explaining that he had learned to play guitar by slowing down Carl's Sun records, note by note, trying to master his bent note licks. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, they all revered him as a god. This tour was a profound, life-affirming, and deeply surreal experience. In a packed, sweaty London club with his rented amp failing, Paul McCartney himself ran onto the stage and knelt at Carl's feet, holding the connections in place so his hero could finish his solo. The Beatles would go on to record 5 of his songs, including Matchbox and Honey Don't, more than any other artist they ever covered, outside of their own work. He was, for a few weeks, a king again, but then the tour ended, and he had to fly home. When he returned to America, nothing had changed. The British invasion, the very movement he had just been celebrated by, had now made him even more of a relic. He was still a one-hit wonder. He was still playing for pennies. The psychological whiplash was brutal. To be worshipped as a god by the Beatles, only to return to a country that saw him as a failure. It was a cruel joke. He had been given a glimpse of the kingdom that should have been his, only to have the door slammed in his face all over again. He fell deeper into the bottle. His drinking, once a way to numb the pain of his neck injury, was now a way to numb the pain of his entire life. While Carl Perkins was struggling to be remembered, Johnny Cash was in a desperate, terrifying struggle to survive himself. The 1960s were the years of his darkest, deepest, and most dangerous addiction. The amphetamines he had dabbled with in Germany, the pills he took to survive the grueling tour schedule, were now in complete control. He was no longer taking them to stay awake. He was taking them to live. He was, by his own admission, taking 100 pills a day, washing them down with booze. He was a walking, talking chemical disaster, and he was the biggest star in country music. His life became a blur of chaos and violence. He was a walking contradiction, a Jekyll and Hyde. On stage, he was the consummate professional. Off stage, he was a monster. His rap sheet became a legend. In 1965, he was arrested in El Paso, Texas. He had been on a multi-day bender in Mexico and was caught at the border, his guitar case overflowing with pills, hundreds of amphetamines and barbiturates. He was the most famous drug mule in America. That same year, he was arrested in Starkville, Mississippi. In the middle of the night, high on pills and profoundly paranoid, he was caught trespassing on a private property, trying to pick flowers. But his most infamous and most terrifying act of self-destruction came in June 1965. He was driving his new truck, Jesse James, in the Los Padres National Forest in California. He was high, paranoid, and completely disconnected from reality. An oil leak in the truck started a small fire. Cash, in a drug-fueled daze, stumbled away from the vehicle as the fire spread to the dry brush. It became a raging inferno. He didn't run for help. He didn't try to put it out. He just watched. The fire burned for days. It destroyed 508 acres of pristine forest, and it wiped out 49 of the 53 endangered California condors that lived in the sanctuary. When he was finally arrested and dragged before a judge, the government lawyer, enraged, asked him, "Did you do this?" Cash, in the absolute depths of his drug-induced psychosis, sneered at him. "No," he said, "my truck did, and it's dead, so you can't question it." He was sued by the federal government and fined over $82,000. He was, quite literally, burning his world to the ground. His personal life was an even bigger wasteland. His marriage to Vivian, the woman he had written thousands of passionate letters to from Germany, was disintegrating. She could no longer handle the violence, the adultery, the constant, terrifying presence of a man who was no longer her husband, but a hollow-eyed skeletal ghost. They filed for divorce in 1966. He was on a collision course with death. He weighed less than 160 pounds. His jaw was gaunt, his eyes black holes. He was going to die. And yet, and this is the divine, baffling contradiction of Johnny Cash, in the midst of this personal hell, he was producing the most politically brave, artistically important, and morally courageous work of his career. In 1964, while at his most addicted, he released the album Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian. This was not a commercial album. It was an act of political warfare. It was a concept album, a blistering, angry, meticulously researched polemic about the centuries of abuse, lies, and genocide committed by the U.S. government against Native Americans. In 1964, this was not a popular opinion. It was a significant commercial risk. Country radio, the backbone of his success, refused to play it. DJs, record execs, even his own label, Columbia, told him to back off. It was too controversial, too un-American. The old defiant J.R. Cash, the one who had watched his brother die and felt a kinship with all the world's oppressed, roared to the surface. He was a drug addict, yes, but he was a righteous one. He took out a full-page ad in Billboard magazine, a blistering, legendary open letter to the entire industry. He wrote, and I quote, "Where are your guts? The Ballad of Ira Hayes is strong medicine, but the stations are afraid of it. I had to fight back when I realized that so many stations are afraid of Bitter Tears. Ballad of Ira Hayes is a true story. I'm appealing to your known professional integrity. I'm asking you to have the guts to play it." He called them cowards to their faces in their own trade paper. This was the Man in Black, a man who could burn down a national forest, but who would also risk his entire career to tell the truth for a people who had no voice. He was a sinner and a saint, locked in the same emaciated body. But the body was giving out. By 1968, he knew it was over. He was losing the fight. His heart, damaged by years of amphetamine abuse, was failing. He was living in a drug-fueled haze in a small apartment with Waylon Jennings, another notorious addict. He was destined for an overdose, a forgotten headline. As he later told it, he went into a cave near Chattanooga, Tennessee, convinced he was dying and intending to let it happen. But as he lay there waiting for the end, he felt something, not a voice, but a presence, a profound, overwhelming sense of clarity, of peace, of God. He realized he was not in control. He realized he did not want to die. He gathered the last of his strength, crawled out of the cave, and walked back into the light. He walked straight to the home of the one person who had been his rock and his biggest critic on tour for years, June Carter. She was the woman who had seen the monster and still loved the man. He told her, "I'm done. I need help." June and her family, Maybelle and Ezra, took him in. They moved him into their home. They forced him to go cold turkey. They sat with him. They prayed with him. They held him as his body writhed in the agony of withdrawal. They quite literally saved his life. In 1968, Johnny Cash was reborn. He was sober, he was clear-eyed, and he was in love. He proposed to June on stage, and they were married on March 1st, 1968. Even before he married June, Cash's first major project as a clear-eyed man was a radical idea. He had long had a deep personal empathy for prisoners. He felt because of his brother's death and his own sins that he was one of them. He decided to record a live album, not at Carnegie Hall, but inside the walls of Folsom Prison. His label Columbia thought he was insane. It was a career ender. But Cash, now clear-eyed and fearless, would not be denied. On January 13th, 1968, while still technically engaged to June, Johnny Cash, backed by his longtime guitarist Luther Perkins and the Tennessee Three, walked onto that makeshift stage in the Folsom cafeteria in front of 2,000 inmates. The resulting album at Folsom Prison is one of the greatest live recordings in human history. It is the sound of raw, unfiltered, dangerous authenticity. It was a massive runaway hit. It shot to #1 on the country charts, crossed over to the pop charts, and made Johnny Cash the single most respected, authentic, and dangerous man in American music. He was reborn. But this triumph was immediately shattered by tragedy. Just 7 months later, in August 1968, Luther Perkins, the man whose boom chicka boom sound had defined Cash's entire career, died tragically in a house fire. Cash was devastated. He had lost his musical brother, his right hand. He needed a new guitarist, but more than that, he needed someone who understood his roots, his sound, and his soul. And what was the very first thing he did as a newly sober man, now facing a new tragedy? He looked around and he saw his old friend, Carl Perkins. Carl, by this point, was at his own absolute bottom. His career was non-existent. His brother was dead. And in 1968, he, too, had hit a wall. He had gone on a terrifying alcoholic binge, a bender so severe that he began to suffer from the same post-crash hallucinations that had plagued him for a decade. He was seeing things that weren't there. He was drinking himself to death, trying to kill the ghosts of 1956 and 1958. Johnny Cash, the man who had just saved himself, now set out to save his brother. He didn't just give Carl a pep talk. He didn't just give him a loan. He gave him a job. He gave him dignity. He hired Carl Perkins as the new featured lead guitarist in his touring revue, The Johnny Cash Show. It was one of the most profound, quiet acts of brotherhood in music history. Carl, his career saved, his life given new purpose, his sobriety supported by his friend, wanted to thank him. He couldn't repay him with money, so he gave him a song. It was a song he had written about their shared roots, about the poverty, the cotton fields, and the one thing that had saved them both, the gospel music their parents sang. It was called Daddy Sang Bass. Cash recorded it, with Carl playing that signature guitar line and the Carter family, including June, singing the soaring chorus, "Me and little brother, we join right in there." It was their story. It was a hymn to their shared survival. The song, released in late 1968, was a massive runaway #1 hit for 6 weeks. It was nominated for a CMA award. It was the perfect poetic summary of their entire relationship. Carl gave Johnny a song about a brother. Johnny, in turn, had become the brother Carl had lost. The redemption at Folsom Prison and the success of Daddy Sang Bass were not an ending. They were the start of a new global empire. The 1970s, for Johnny Cash, were the decade of his absolute cultural anointment. He was no longer just a country singer or a pop chart curiosity. He was, quite simply, the man in black, a living, breathing piece of American folklore. A man who had walked through hell and returned not just with his soul intact, but with a new, profound moral authority. And he used that authority to build a platform not just for himself, but for his brother. In June 1969, ABC Television, in a bold and brilliant move, gave Johnny Cash his own national primetime variety show. The Johnny Cash Show was an earthquake. At a time when America was tearing itself apart at the seams, divided by the Vietnam War, by generational conflict, by a bitter culture war, Johnny Cash's show became the one tiny patch of neutral ground. It was the only place on television where the silent majority and the counterculture met in peace. Cash was a cultural bridge, a man trusted by both sides. He used his immense platform with a radical, quiet courage. He had the evangelist Billy Graham on the same season as the fiercely political folk singer Joni Mitchell. He had the clean-cut Glenn Campbell on the same stage as the hippie troubadour Bob Dylan. And who was standing next to him week after week in the spotlight? His lead guitarist, his old friend from Sun Records, Carl Perkins. This was not a small gesture. Cash forced the network to feature Carl. He would stop the show, walk over to his guitarist, put his arm around him, and, with a genuine love and respect that radiated through the camera, he would tell the national audience, "This is the man who started it all. This is the architect of rock and roll. This is Mr. Carl Perkins." He gave Carl his own solo spots. He had him on as a guest, not just a band member. In April 1969, Carl was a featured performer on the Kraft Music Hall, singing his song Restless. He was collaborating with the hip rock band NRBQ. He was, for the first time since that fateful crash in 1956, a respected, celebrated, invisible star again. Cash didn't just give his friend a job, he gave him back his name. This was the era of their greatest collaboration. Cash continued to lean on Carl's authentic, earthy songwriting. He recorded The Ballad of Boot Hill, a song Carl had written back in 1959. Carl, in turn, was writing hits for other members of their circle, like Rise and Shine, which became a top 10 hit for Cash's younger brother, Tommy Cash, in 1970. They toured the world together as part of the Johnny Cash Show review. They were a family. June Carter and the Carter family, the Statler brothers, and Carl Perkins. They were an unstoppable force, becoming one of the most successful touring acts in the world, with a cultural reach second only to the Beatles. Cash, now a global icon, cemented his legacy. He married June Carter in 1968. Their son, John Carter Cash, was born in 1970. He released Gospel Road, a Passion Project film about the life of Jesus, in 1973. He wrote his first autobiography, Man in Black, in 1975, a book that told his story of sin and redemption to a waiting world. They appeared together on Hee Haw in 1974, and their CBS Christmas specials were a national tradition. He also critically continued his activism. He became the undisputed voice for prison reform. He performed countless free concerts at prisons, not for publicity, but because he genuinely believed in the humanity of the men inside. He even took his crusade to the White House. In a now legendary 1970 meeting, President Richard Nixon, hoping to score political points with Middle America, invited Cash to perform. Nixon's staff handed Cash a list of approved songs they wanted him to play, including the divisive anti-protest anthem, Okie from Muskogee. Johnny Cash, the ex-pill addict and son of a sharecropper, stood in the Oval Office, looked the most powerful man in the world in the eye, and politely but firmly refused. He told the president he didn't know those songs. Instead, he played his songs. He played What is Truth, a song that questioned the war, and he played The Ballad of Ira Hayes, his brutal, heartbreaking song about the Native American war hero who died a forgotten drunk. It was an act of profound, quiet rebellion. He was the man in black, and he would not be used. But underneath this mountain of success, the old cracks were beginning to show. The old demons were not dead, they were only sleeping. For Carl, the demon was the past. As the outline for our story notes throughout the 1970s, He was locked in a bitter, draining legal battle with Sam Phillips. He was fighting for the rights to his own songs, for the royalties from blue suede shoes that he had, in his youthful naivete, signed away for a pittance. It was a fight for his financial future, but it was also a fight for his respect. He had lost his crown to Elvis, his brother to the crash. He was not going to let Sam Phillips steal his legacy. It was a fight that would consume him for years, but one he was determined to resolve. He was also, according to some reports, quietly paranoid. His fame and his association with a politically active star like Cash made him wary. He was a man who had been through trauma, and he saw threats everywhere. He allegedly began to carry a gun, not out of aggression, but out of a deep-seated fear that the world, which had already tried to kill him once, might try again. For Cash, the old demons were not dead, they were only sleeping. In 1977, following a routine dental surgery, he was prescribed painkillers. For a recovering addict, this was not medicine, it was a loaded gun. The pills, meant to dull the physical pain, reawoken the chemical demon he had kept chained up since 1968. And once again, he relapsed, relying heavily on the pills to get through. The paranoia and the physical agony returned, making him erratic and lost to his family once more. He fought his way back to sobriety, only to fall again. In 1981, on his farm, Cash had a bizarre, almost comical accident. He was attacked and kicked by an ostrich he kept on his property. It was not a small kick. The bird was powerful. It broke several of his ribs and tore open his stomach. The pain was immense, and he was rushed into surgery. Once again, he was prescribed powerful painkillers. The result was tragically predictable. He fell deep into his old addiction once more. The tension in his marriage to June, the woman who had saved him, returned with a vengeance. He was once again the hollow-eyed ghost he had been in the 1960s. He was unreliable, paranoid, and in pain. And this time, the roles were reversed. Now it was Carl Perkins who was the sober one. It was Carl, the steady hand, the man who had walked through his own fire and survived, who was on the tour bus. It was Carl who had to watch his brother, his boss, his savior, succumb to the very demons he had helped him conquer. He didn't pass judgment. He didn't preach. He was just there. He was the rock. He supported Cash. He covered for him. He helped June try to hold the fractured pieces of their family and their tour together. Their brotherhood had now come full circle. Cash had saved Carl's career and his life. Now, Carl was helping to save Cash's soul. As the 1970s, a decade that had begun with such triumph, came to a close, the man in black was once again lost in the wilderness. His television show was long gone, his old addiction was back with a vengeance, and his professional decline was accelerating. The raw, organic sound he and Perkins had championed was being replaced by the slick pop country production of Urban Cowboy. The dawning 1980s would force a new trial on both men. For Cash, it would be a battle for relevance against an industry ready to discard him, while for Carl, it would be a final, glorious renaissance, as his other disciples finally came home to pay their respects to the architect. For Johnny Cash, this was the beginning of his second great wilderness. He had fought his way back to sobriety after the 1981 ostrich kick relapse, but his relationship with his label, Columbia Records, was broken. His chart success for the first time in his career had completely dried up. The label, now run by a new generation of executives, saw him as a relic, a living legend who couldn't sell records. In 1984, in what is often cited as the most disrespectful act in music history, the label forced him to record a song so absurd, so insulting, It was clearly meant to be a career ender. The song was Chicken in Black. The premise: Johnny Cash's brain is transplanted into a chicken. The music video, which Cash performed with a grim professional stoicism, featured him acting like a chicken after a brain transplant, at one point wearing a bizarre feathered cape and mask. It was a profound public humiliation. It was the label's way of saying, "You are a joke to us." Cash was furious, later claiming he had been imposed upon, but the damage was done. The Man in Black had been reduced to a poultry-themed parody. In 1986, after 28 years and a catalog that had defined American music, Columbia Records unceremoniously dropped Johnny Cash. He was 54 years old, a living legend, and he was effectively without a record label. But while Cash's career was entering its deepest winter, his old friend Carl Perkins was, unexpectedly, having a major career renaissance. This time, his revival was not orchestrated by one man, but by the entire generation of superstars who had learned from him. In 1981, Paul McCartney, the biggest rock star on the planet, invited Carl to his tug-of-war recording sessions in Montserrat. This was not a charity gig. This was a Beatle inviting his hero to collaborate as an equal. They recorded the duet Get It, a playful, joyous track that put Carl's voice and guitar back on the global airwaves. Then, in 1985, came the ultimate coronation. A television special was filmed in London, a celebration of his music. It was called Blue Suede Shoes, a rockabilly session. It was Carl's night. And look who showed up to be his backing band. On guitar, George Harrison of the Beatles and Eric Clapton. On the drums, Ringo Starr. On the piano, Dave Edmunds. This was more than a tribute. The most prominent figures in rock music had come to pay homage to the architect. You can see it in the footage. Harrison, a global icon, stands just behind Carl, beaming, watching his hero's fingers, just like he must have as a teenager. Clapton, God himself, respectfully trades licks with the master. It was a profound, moving, and public declaration. This is the man. This is where it all came from. The honors, so long delayed, now came in a flood. In 1986, he reunited with Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Roy Orbison for the album Class of '55, a nostalgic look back at the Sun Records dynasty. And in 1987, the ultimate validation. Carl Perkins was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was in the second class alongside influential artists like B.B. King and Aretha Franklin. The sharecropper's son, the one-hit wonder, the man whose career was shattered by a twist of fate, was now officially and forever immortalized as a founding father. Even his songwriting found new life. Let Me Tell You About Love, a song he co-wrote, was recorded by the Judds in 1989 and became a #1 country hit. He was, at last, at peace. He had his respect. He had his royalties, having finally resolved his long battle for royalties with Sam Phillips. And he had his legacy. While Carl was being celebrated, Johnny Cash was still in the wilderness. He was a man without a label, a star without a major platform. He found solace in a new brotherhood. In 1985, he formed the Highwaymen with his old friends, the other outlaws of country music, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Chris Christopherson. They were a supergroup of legends, and their first album was a #1 hit, giving Cash a temporary but vital lifeline. But as a solo artist, he was adrift. He was playing casinos and state fairs. He was a nostalgia act. He was sober, but relapses in 1983, 1989, and 1992 proved the demon was always waiting. And then, in 1993, came the phone call that would change everything. The call was from a producer named Rick Rubin. Rubin was the antithesis of Nashville. He was a long-bearded Zen-like guru who had founded Def Jam Records. He was the man responsible for the sound of the Beastie Boys, Run DMC, and Slayer. He was a hip-hop and thrash metal producer, and he worshipped Johnny Cash. Rubin flew to Nashville and made Cash a simple, profound offer. He said, "I want to sign you to my label, American Recordings, and I want you to sit in my living room with one acoustic guitar, and I want you to sing me every song you love. I don't care if it's a hymn, a folk song, a murder ballad, or a song you wrote yesterday. I just want you." For Cash, a man who had been forced into a chicken suit by his last label, this was the sound of his artistic rebirth. The resulting album, 1994's American Recordings, was a masterpiece of raw, naked power. It was just Cash's voice, now weathered and cracked with age, and his guitar. It was the sound of a legend stripped bare, confronting his own sins, his faith, and his mortality. It was released not to country radio, but to rock radio. He played the main stage at the Glastonbury Festival in 1994 in front of 100,000 college kids in a mud pit who treated him like the second coming. He won a Grammy for Best Contemporary Folk Album. Johnny Cash, at 62 years old, was the coolest, most dangerous, and most relevant man on the planet. Again, his revival was a triumph. The follow-up album, Unchained, in 1996, won another Grammy. He was a hero to a new generation. From Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, whose song Hurt he would later make his own definitive epitaph, to Tom Petty. He was back. He was the man in black, reborn for a new millennium. But as Cash was ascending to this final mythical peak, his brother was fading. In 1997, Carl Perkins's body, the one that had been broken and battered but had always survived, finally began to fail him. He had suffered from throat cancer, but now he was hit by a series of severe strokes. The man who had lived his entire life in motion was now immobilized. He gave his last major concert in Montserrat in September 1997. He was frail, but his spirit was undimmed. On January 19, 1998, Carl Lee Perkins died from complications of the strokes. He was 65 years old. The architect was gone. At the funeral, a frail and visibly heartbroken Johnny Cash sat in the front row. His brother, the man who had been with him at the beginning in that tiny studio, the man who had played guitar at Folsom, the man who had shared his highest highs and his lowest, darkest lows, was gone. Cash himself was now in a desperate fight. In 1997, he had been misdiagnosed with Shy-Drager syndrome, a debilitating neurological disease. The real diagnosis wasn't much better: severe autonomic neuropathy and complications from diabetes. He was in constant pain. He was confined to a wheelchair, but he kept recording. His work with Rick Rubin had become his reason to live. He was working against time. In 1998, he was hospitalized with severe pneumonia, an event that nearly killed him, but he kept fighting. Then, in 2003, came the one blow from which he could not recover. The one blow that was worse than the death of Jack, worse than the drugs, worse than any professional failure. On May 15, 2003, his wife, his rock, his savior, June Carter Cash, died unexpectedly from complications following heart surgery. This was the one loss he could not withstand. As the outline states, it tore him up. He was utterly, completely, and inconsolably lost. He survived her by only 4 months. 4 months of agonizing grief and fading health. In one of their last conversations, he told Rick Rubin, "I need to work because I will not be long on this earth." He went into the studio, even in his wheelchair, even in his profound grief, and he recorded. He sang until his voice gave out. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003. He was 71. The story of Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash is one of intertwined fates. It's a story of two men, born in the same poverty, who found a new religion in the raw sound of the American South. One, Carl Perkins, was a creative genius. He was the architect. He wrote the blueprint for rock and roll on a greasy potato sack. His legacy is not just in his own records, it's burned into the DNA of the Beatles. It lives in the licks George Harrison spent a lifetime chasing, and it explodes from every rockabilly band that ever strapped on a guitar. But his story is also one of the great American tragedies. It is the profound, agonizing story of what if. What if he hadn't been in that car? What if fate hadn't intervened? He was the pioneer who, through a single moment of tragic luck, lost his career's momentum. He was the man who had to watch his friends live the life that should have been his. The other, Johnny Cash, became the icon. His was a slower, darker path. His success was not immediate, but something he had to reclaim from his personal struggles. Again and again, he became the man in black, a global symbol of sin, redemption, and raw authenticity. He was the voice for the voiceless, the prisoner, the Native American, the poor, the sinner in all of us. He became and remains a powerful American conscience. In the end, their relationship was perhaps the most honest and profound in all of music. It was a bond forged in a tiny studio and sealed in a prison cafeteria. They were two survivors. When one fell, the other was there to help him up. Cash gave Perkins a stage, a career, and his dignity when the world had forgotten him. Perkins gave Cash a #1 hit, a timeless gospel song about brotherhood, just when he was being reborn. They were the two who had seen it all, from the suffocating dust of the cotton fields to the blinding lights of global stardom. They weren't rivals. They were the brothers who survived.